Well, good evening. And for all of you joining us, just want to welcome you to this special Culture Care event, a conversation between Eugenia Leigh and EJ Koh. And just thankful that you could join us tonight. I just wanted to briefly introduce and give you a lay of the land. About 7 years ago, the painter and writer Mako Fujimura wrote a book called Culture Care. And in it, he argued for an end to the culture wars and considering what he calls culture care, which is in a time when we see such division in our society, artists are uniquely able to bring us together through their work while also bringing beauty into our lives through what they make. And I can't think of two artists that embody this ideal more than the two poets that are joining us tonight. The writings of both Eugenia Leigh and EJ Koh don't avoid the reality of pain and suffering that so many of us experience living in this world. But through their work, we also get to encounter hope and forgiveness and redemption. And before I formally introduce them tonight, I wanted to briefly just share what to expect from the evening. After I introduce our two guests, I'm going to disappear from the screen, and Eugenia and EJ will have a conversation together about their work. And then I'm going to join, and they're going to each read from their writing. They're each going to share a piece with us. And then the floor will be open for you for about 15 minutes or so to ask questions. And so I encourage you to be submitting questions throughout their conversation, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. You could just use the chat feature to submit those. And so now, without further ado, let me introduce our guest for the evening. Eugenia Leigh is the author of Blood, Sparrows, and Sparrows, published by Four Way Books in 2014. Her poems and essays have appeared and are forthcoming in numerous publications, including Plowshares, Waxwing, The Rumpus, North American Review, the Best New Poets 2010 Anthology, and the 2017 Best of the Net Anthology. She's a recipient of fellowships and awards from Poets and Writers Magazine, Kundiman, Rattle, and elsewhere, and Eugenia received her MFA from Sarah Lawrence College. And our second guest tonight is EJ Koh, who's the author of the memoir, The Magical Language of Others, by Tin House Books in 2020, and the poetry collection, A Lesser Love, from Louisiana State University Press, and the winner of the Pleiades Editor's Prize for Poetry. And her poems, translations, and stories have appeared in the Boston Review, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Slate, and World Literature Today. She earned her MFA in Creative Writing and Literary Translation from Columbia University and is completing the PhD program at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's a recipient of the McDowell, Kundiman, and American Literary Translators Association Fellowships. So two very distinguished guests we have tonight. And with that, I am gonna leave, and we're gonna get to hear them talk. So we'll be back soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Hi, EJ. It's very strange to be on here and not see anybody else. It feels like kind of like a private conversation.
I know, it's just unique.
Yeah. Well, I guess first I want to say congratulations. Your memoir is it moved me so much, and not just because your mom reminded me very much of my own mother, but I think the way that you were able to access so much pain and so much emotion, but treat it with such care. Like, it never felt sentimental. It never felt like dramatic in a way that I think sometimes memoirs, did you hear that piercing sound? I didn't know what that was. But I felt like there was a very, very wise tone throughout your treatment of the characters and of the story itself. And I think the thing that really stood out to me the most was your descriptions of the ways that trauma becomes manifested in the physical body and in the way that we treat our bodies, and your own experience with your body as you were living through these very difficult years. And I guess I was wondering, as a writer, then now revisiting this trauma, revisiting a lot of this pain and this difficulty, what was the physical experience like for you as you wrote your memoir?
Oh man, And by the way, thank you for making the time and to do this with me, Eugenia, and also reading the memoir and preparing for everything. And I just feel so lucky to be in conversation with you. I'm just a big reader of your poetry and your work, and I just know that we have so many connections, and I already feel a sisterhood with you. So thank you for doing this with me.
I feel that too. Thank you.
It was just a great opportunity, this conversation, to go back and read some of your old work and your other poems throughout the years. And I was thinking, oh, I don't want to cry today. Why is this?
I have tissues. Can't give them to you, but I have them.
I was like, oh man, these poems. But so thank you. And how writing this memoir and the physical experience of taking the trauma into the body. It's so interesting. When my father got that job offer, I was 14 years old, and by the time they moved, I was 15. And so years later, about 9 years later, when I reunited with them, they moved back and moved to Seattle, and I was in New York, sort of underwater at the time, and I came to Seattle to see them. I noticed that at the time we moved in together, I almost reverted back to being 14.
Mm-hmm.
The sensation was so odd and strange, and I could, even now I have difficulty describing it, but there was almost like an internal emotional clock inside me. And when they left, it stopped. There was, even as, let's say, the time outside passed and I got older and I had these new experiences, there were parts of me that never grew up and never really experienced very basic things with my parents and with my mother. So when we were together again, it was like trying to return and start again. And so there was quite a bit of maturing I had to do. And because I was so, and still am, very immature in some ways. I think, for instance, there's a poem I wrote, and it was a scene that almost made into the memoir, but it's the idea of when my mother asked me what I prefer or what I like to eat. That's a very common conversation, but there's this sort of little tick I have where she'll say, what was it that you liked, or was it this or that? And that illusion going into the gap between us, the absent in space of how much we actually have to try and get to know each other again. And there was a bit heartbreaking and in my body. So I'm sure I'm going to keep talking about this for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah. That reminds me of something that my therapist told me, which is that trauma is, yeah, I know. I'm probably gonna talk about my therapist a lot.
I would be, please, yeah.
But she told me that trauma is a memory disorder. And whenever I feel very flooded by like that, the feelings of pain, like as if it's happening in real time, and I feel like the 14-year-old self, my therapist always stops me and she asks me, how old are you right now? And I have to say, oh yeah, right now I am 22, I am 14. Like I'm not, an older person. And it's just, I think having that as like a mental exercise was really helpful for me in allowing myself to be immature when I guess the occasion calls for it. Because, you're right. Like it is such a simple thing, right? A mother asking like, what was it that you like again? But I imagine that for you, and I apologize if I'm like speaking on your behalf, but I imagine that it's like that's such a painful question, you know, like, because the 14-year-old mind is saying, well, you should know, like, you're my mother, you should know what I want to eat. And I think I often have that experience with my own mother as well. But I appreciate you sharing that. And I appreciated that at the end of the memoir with the fish and with the mackerel, right? And the mother, you know, she's preparing the food, and I guess the daughter or you refuses to eat it, but then you did love it. But it's just that like dissonance and that disconnect, I guess, is very real. And so I guess speaking of your mother and your family, have they read your memoir? And if yes, like how have they received it?
I remember when I was working on the memoir, I hardly, I didn't show any of it to anybody for such a long time. And I think it took, I mean, it was nearly complete by the time one of the chapters, the quote chapter, it's the second prose chapter, was picked up by Slate, and it was the first time any part of the manuscript was really getting out there. So I remember when they published it, I was, how do you say, I was low key about it. I was a little quiet and hesitant, and maybe in a part of me hoping, oh, people are gonna miss this, so I'll post it or maybe not have to share it so much. But at the time I was working in New York in Midtown, and I was in this tall office building, and I went to the restroom really quick, and I get a text on my phone, and it's my brother, and he's like, and all it says is, I read it, these 3 words, and I was so terrified. And so I'm just waiting, you know, the ... that modern technological anxiety of waiting for the next text message. And he said he loved it. He said that's our mother. And I think that was the first time in that whole process of writing the memoir that somebody other than myself, and also somebody in my family, by the way, kind of confirmed for me that I wasn't imagining all of this, that I'm not creating my mother to be this way, that if anything, I had toned down the way she is, maybe even slightly, and amped up every bad thing I've done. But more or less to hear, it was important for me, I think, to hear him say that sounds like our mother, and he's just glad that I wrote it. So that was the experience with my brother. My parents have copies of the memoir. I don't know if they've read it. I think my mom knows which letters are in because she's known that I've been translating. But one of my last readings for my book tour was in Seattle, and I ended with some of these smaller readings that were scattered throughout, and my mother joined me in one of them. And it was so funny. She showed up so dressed up and elegant and beautiful, you know, waving her hand and sort of welcoming, you know, ushering everyone in her seat. She's just a star, you know. It's really tough to not like see her. And after the reading, I remember the line to talk to her was longer than the line to do the book signing for me. And I thought, oh, that's so like my mom. You know, she's really a big personality. You know, she'll cry extra hard while I'm reading her letter, and then she'll be fine right away and be tickled by some little joke. But yeah, I think she hasn't read it super closely because of her English. She's probably going to have to wait until we have a Korean translation, but the content, and she's been a part of the process in some ways. And yeah, that's how it's been. They're they've been quite nice about the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, as my parents, they're curious about it. They're just wondering. They're astonished, I think, that you can write something and somebody else wants to read it. to at the very simplest level. And I remember, I don't know if I can say this. It's okay. I was in a classroom, and somebody had asked me a similar question about dealing with my parents' reactions to the memoir. And if I were really, if I were completely honest, I would think that the memoir is, in some ways, it's so small compared to how many big and terrible things we've had to go through together, and things we've done to each other, and the things we're still working on. That sort of the scope of this memoir in comparison is sort of a little pause, I think.
That's a good perspective to have, I think. And what is your experience like when your mother comes to like a reading? Or I was just, I think, I don't know if it's my own personal history, but when I read the part where you're at the residency in New Hampshire and you drove up with your mother, it was like watching a horror film for me. I was like, no, don't take your mom. And then to see her presence there, and the way that you capture the tension in the moments as you're up teaching the workshop that you're unprepared for, and your mother is there with the folder of blank sheets of paper, waving it like, do you need any more? And I was like, oh, I can picture this so clearly that I started to, I feel like, see flashes of my own mother. And I was like, now I'm conflating, and this is very triggering to me. But I guess I was just wondering, like, what is the experience like for you? Because I feel like you tell these stories and you treat them with such care. And I feel that you do accomplish what you say in the middle of the book, that you want your writing to be magnanimous. And I sense that even though we get the big personality of the mother and we get a lot of the traumas that she has caused, the book is so gentle toward her as well. And so I guess I'm wondering, when you invite her into these experiences that are yours, like that you've earned, and you have authority in these places, and to allow her big personality into those spaces, I guess I'm just wondering, like, what are you thinking? What are you hoping for? What are you afraid of?
That's a great question. And I love that we're talking about that moment with my mother coming to one of my teaching workshops, and she's running around with the paper and asking people if they need apples and they want to take it home. So that I think it's Kathy Park Hong recently published Minor Feelings, and I think there are scenes like that in there as well. This sort of, since the moment of childhood, that feelings, saying, just even as a young child, having to take care of their parents, and the language and the boundaries and the cultural and generational things going on. Everything is so entangled, and we're there in that space, so cognizant of every entanglement. And then you have this character of a mother who's who completely pushes aside that is sort of like a bend into space-time, and they don't, they don't care for any of it. And I, I still feel that, or I feel it even when other people feel it. When my brother feels that way toward my mother and we're at the table, I start to feel tension from witnessing his toward my mother. So it's really interesting. That means this feeling is something you can pass on, or it's contagious as well. But I don't know, I think the moment in the middle of the book, as you mentioned, with magnanimity being one of the first words I learned when I came to poetry. It's so funny. I couldn't even grasp when magnanimity was first explained to me. It took quite a while to understand, and I learned it through writing a poem, because I remember my first poetry teacher saying I can really, when I first came to the class, I was a dancer. I had no idea what I was doing, and then I didn't want to come back, but I wrote like 40 poems that first week when I went home. It was something really burst forth, I think. So when I came back, I remember him saying, you can really start a poem and you have this way of filling in a poem, but you're struggling with ending poems, your turn. And at the time I needed more explanation. How do you end a poem? And the practice was really simple, actually. It was that when you write these poems about your mother, by the end of the poem, you have to forgive your mother, or the poem has to forgive you for not forgiving her. And I think that that was so, just imagining myself, a young adult, experiencing those words and saying, how do you do that? I'm not even ready or prepared. But poetry, I mean, for every poem, that was the practice I was putting into it. And so when I was writing the memoir, it was the same sense that there has to be a turn for every chapter. There has to be a turn for the whole memoir, where I'm able to write in a way that I'm able to write as the person I hope to be, as the person I hope to become, even if that's not something I can manage right now. At least when we get to the end. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like we're going anywhere, or I'm not moving anywhere. I have a friend, he's a librarian at the University of Washington. He was one of the very few people I would show some of my memoir to, like at the time, the manuscript. And I remember him saying that this memoir for me is a book of discovery. I mean, however the memoir came out, there are huge parts of the memoir that had to be written for me to learn something. Every part of the memoir I was trying for the first time, and I was learning these things as I was going. So it really, I thought that's true. This book really is a book of discovery for me, something I had to go through. And in that vein of feeling, of engaging in magnanimity, I think when you have a personality like my mother's, and you kind of see her relationship with her mother being very similar. Her mother was so incredible, was such a force. I guess I felt like broadening and growing large enough to hold her, having the simultaneity of both myself and her in one space. That wasn't about sort of contracting the scene or myself to say, there's no room for you here. It was sort of the very opposite. I was learning how to let go, for lack of a, that's really hard to sort of encompass, but letting go and expanding and having a sense of flexibility to allow her in and not let it destroy me, I think.
I think that's beautiful, and I think it sort of ties in really lovelily with the way that at that residency, or no, not, maybe it wasn't at the residency, but it was later on when your mother was talking to a guest, and the guest asks, what does your daughter do? And eventually she says, my daughter teaches people how to let go. And it's so beautiful that that was your own experience of the book and of writing the book. And who better to teach people to let go than somebody who has labored to do that through her own writing. And so I guess I'm wondering, and it looks like this might be the last question or so, because I'm getting a chat from Chris. But I guess I'm wondering, what does that mean to you to teach others how to let go? And how do you do that in your own teaching and in your interactions with your readers? And, or maybe the first question is it true? Like, did you, because we don't really get your response when your mother tells the guest this, that my daughter teaches people how to let go. But I felt like it was such a beautiful moment, because I felt like in that moment, it seemed to me that the mother got it. Like, she gets what you do, you know, she gets the depth and the importance of the work that you do. And it was such a redemptive moment to me. And so I'm wondering what your experience of that is, and what that means to you.
Thank you. That's such a great question. Yeah, I remember being in my mother's house, and I remember her guests being over, and my mother loves, so the room is always filled with so much light, or whatever she can do to get light in the windows, extra lamps, extra reflecting things, that everything is clear, everything has to be glass or very white surfaces or pale surfaces to get. And I remember the room was just that way, and she had her guests over, and I remember her explaining to them what I do. And for me, I mean, I understood that her saying that my daughter's a poet, I mean, that wasn't translatable on me. It was because she's speaking in Korean with her guests, and there's something of that moment in which I'm translating her throughout the whole memoir. But when we see the way my mother is with her friends, and the way she talks about me and says who I am for herself, that's her translation. She's translating me to them and translating what I do. And so I really wanted her to have that too. And we get that from her letters, but to see her sort of take everything in and say what she feels is the most significant thing without saying the thing. She just teaches people how to let go. I really like that meaning too, so thank you. And in terms of how I bring that into, how I apply that to everyday life and to students, to friends and family, and to myself. And something that I talk about often is setting the table. And I don't know if have you heard of this before? I don't know if I've mentioned it to you. I learned it when I was at the Asian Educators Alliance in San Francisco a few years ago, and I loved it, and it stayed with me. I use it all the time, and in any atmosphere, it's my favorite thing. It's basically when you're in conversation with someone, or you have two opposing ideas, you set the table. And what that is you're imagining that there's a really large table before you. And that other idea or that person's argument, let's say, they can put that on the table. And you can always add things to the table. But you can never take things off the table. And something like that is so helpful when thinking of ideas that might oppose one another, but making room for that they might both be true at the same time. And so you're constantly setting the table. And that's really great for kind of talking about relationships with other people, talking about trying to settle arguments is really great. Trying to, I mean, I use it for translation sometimes, for understanding a word. I mean, how would you define Han? Let's say Han is something I talk about quite a bit. And you just add things to the table of what Han is without taking anything off. And then you're really allowed to sit back a bit and see the scope of what Han could be, to allow your sort of mind and heart to stretch with the definition. And so I really enjoy the concept. It's been very helpful.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. If Chris is okay with me asking more questions, I can ask questions all night, but I'm not sure if he wanted to. He says, yes, it's okay to ask more questions. So I guess with the idea of setting the table, and especially with regard to translation, and I guess I want to go back a little bit to what you said about having to translate your mother, not just her letters, but her mannerisms, her language, the way that she speaks. My Korean isn't very good, but I have like an elementary level. I was able to read the letters. And I think the thing that was really striking to me was how true you were to the Korean idioms and the literal way of saying things in Korean. And just your descriptions were, you weren't trying to translate it for a white audience. It didn't feel like it felt more like you were trying to just say in English what we say in Korean, or what, like even just the shape of like tuk, like in tteokguk, like rice cake, like the oval shaped rice cake. I was like, it's an oval, but it never occurred to me that it's an oval shape. But you're able to just describe things so authentically that we don't lose the Korean. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I guess I'm wondering what was that choice, or what was kind of the thought process behind that?
I'm so enamored with you, Eugenia. This is a great conversation, and these questions are wonderful. And oh, it makes me just want to eat up that question. It's so delicious and so great and rejuvenating. When I studied literary translation, there's a long tradition with the way, for me, the way I was taught, right? And in many cases, when you translate sort of one language into English, normally what we do is we translate it so that when you read it in English, it reads as if it was written in the English, so that the English was the original language. Now that's really how I started to translate. And even right after leaving the program, I thought that was the best thing to do, what we might call a seamless translation, a translation that reads easily for an English-speaking audience. But it wasn't long after that I started to question, and honestly, with the help of many other translators around me, but particularly Dong Che and other poet translators, that what I realized was when we do that seamless translation from the Korean to the English, where there's a part of it that's erasure. or erasing the Korean language. So I realized, these languages also have histories, right? There's some Japanese in the book as well. So you take Japanese and Korean and English, that they're not just languages. These languages belong to countries, and those countries have histories, and they have histories with each other, and that are so important, and that go on in the book as well. But that means the languages naturally have sort of a position. There are dominant languages, and there's non-dominant languages. And to translate something from the Korean to the English and erase the Korean felt, this was a political question, right? Translation is then political. When you translate, you're saying something about the histories and these languages, and you're partaking in them. So there's many facets to it, but I think the simple way to say it is, I wanted to translate the Korean to keep the Korean. Mm-hmm. That you can read it in English, but you don't lose the rhythm of the Korean, the nuances of the Korean. Sometimes there are these strange, what might feel like strange word choices, or the idioms really come out in the English, but that's something I wanted to maintain, so that if you understood Korean and you heard or read these English translations, you can actually predict or just say yourself, oh, this is what she's translating. Mm-hmm. And I've had a reader and an audience come up to me and say that he heard me read the letter in English and he knew exactly what was said in the Korean. And I think that was just really important to do for this project.
I think you absolutely accomplished that, because my Korean isn't even that good. And as I was reading the letters and even the conversations, I kept hearing the Korean way of saying these phrases and saying these things. And then I would check and I'd be like, oh, I got it right. And it was such a satisfying experience, because I think when we read other translations, or even when we read subtitles when watching Korean dramas, I think it's the most frustrating thing when I can sense that the translation really was trying to, like you said, make it seem like it was written in English originally. But I think the choice that you made not to do that was so powerful. And I think it gave a depth of, it just made the experience feel so much more real and so much more visceral, at least to the Korean American audience. I am so curious to know what other audiences have experienced through that, but I thought it was such a beautiful choice.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I really enjoy those idioms. Anytime I speak to my mother and father and they say something, I always ask them to say it one more time, and I give them. I like to think of the literal translation in my mind. But thank you. I'm so glad.
And I do have one more question about your experience with translation, especially with the letters. Because at the end of the book, as you meet Tahi and you have the letters with you that you're protecting from the rain, you say that it was difficult that you hadn't read them alone yet, and that it was kind of, you were anticipating a sense of pain as you read these letters. And we never get to see the character EJ in the book read these letters and translate them. We see her being called to this mission, being called to this work, and then we're left to imagine what that experience must have been like. And I guess I'm wondering, what was that like for you, to have to not just read the letters, but to immerse yourself in them so deeply? I imagine that, I won't tell you what I imagine. Why don't you tell us what your experience of that was?
So after I realized I had to translate the letters, I went. That's when I went to New Hampshire. That was when I went to McDowell, and then we had some time in a cabin with no Wi-Fi or connection to anywhere. They sort of put you in the middle of the forest, which is really, was a really, I think it was a good place to be so when I would first translate the letters. I think there were so many things happening at once. In a moment as simple as me picking up her letter in the cabin and reading it for the first time since I was young and I was in Davis. Well, one thing is that some of the letters have watermarks all over them, so the ink is a little smudged. And I understood that those were the tear stains. And there's something happening there where the paper has also, it's not just an artifact because they're my mother's letters, they also are in some cases a museum. They're a museum because they also hold my tears of my former self. And I remember when I saw those tear marks, and I can tell sort of which words would have made me cry and would have upset me to hear. And they're always the kindest words. And it's never the like really devastating news. With that, I feel like there's a hardening and solidifying, but it's always the really sweet things that were said that sort of untethered me, I think. And so I was reading I was reading the letter, seeing my younger self read the letter as I was reading the letter. And the emotions were many times over, right? Because it's her emotions, that the younger version of me, it's her emotions, and then it's slammed into me now, who has done so much work to not feel them. And so you get this sense of distance, being closed so violently and so quickly and spontaneously. And I don't think distance is ever meant to be closed like that. It's meant to be a gradual understanding, but that's what it felt like. It felt really coarse and violent and tough, and it exacerbated the difficulty. But another aspect to this was I wasn't reading it alone. I think that's what I was scared of, was reading this alone, but I wasn't alone. My mother from then is right there. My younger self is also there. It's if anything, it's the four of us, and we're trying to understand what's going on. And if anything, I wish to hold my younger self and say everything's going to be okay, because that girl doesn't know that. They have no idea what's going to come. Another aspect is my Korean is they can translate, and not just when I was younger. When I read her letters, it was focused on what every word signified, and that was it. Now I could sort of read between the lines. I could read her intentions. I could read her sort of inflections in her voice, and see sort of when her words are galloping and when they're very slow and steady. And so the experience was, I think, a lot richer in that sense. For me as a reader and as a translator, as a daughter, it was much richer, but it was different from when I was younger, I would say. So yeah, I just sat there translating them and crying my eyes out for for weeks in the forest, and letting that happen, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think the way that you describe that closing of the distance is just really powerful. And thank you for doing that work for our benefit so that we can then see the fruits of that labor. I know that it was an emotional and physical labor in addition to the intellectual and the mental labor. And I think that doesn't get honored enough when people write memoirs that are this vulnerable and this powerful. And just the fact that you survived that journey to write it, edit it, publish it, and then now to speak about it is just, that's a feat of heroic magnitude. And I think it really does get underestimated. So thank you so much for that work.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. And I know that you also, you know, I'm so familiar with your work and your recent poem as well, Gold. And I mean, even your work before, you write so much about your mother and father, about your family, about the speaker, who I also imagine it comes from that experience. And I mean, I'd love to ask you how it's been to look back at your work since the moment you've written it, and how your relationship with your family has evolved, or if at all.
So it's been about 6 years now since my book of poetry came out, and my relationship with my family has evolved quite a bit. But what's interesting is that I had cut ties with my father right before the book came out because I didn't think I could survive his reactions to it. He had already been sort of harassing me when in the first early stages, when I was publishing poems on the internet and they were easily found. He was my biggest Twitter troll. He would troll me on Twitter, and so I chose to cut off that relationship before the book came out. And I hadn't spoken to him since, until very recently. He emerged. Because he's very sick, and I think I'm still trying to process, like, what does it mean that I made this book kind of without his blessing? And what does it mean that I'm telling these stories? Because I think you sort of mentioned it before, that when you write autobiographically, it's important to be, if you're going to be cruel, you need to be cruelest to the self, right? And then kind of forgive everybody else, or at least be neutral toward them. And in order for any reader to be able to accept you as a narrator and as a person telling these truths. And as much as I try to do that, I think it's difficult when I imagine it's difficult when you become a character. And especially if your version of events is different from that of the book. But I remember Marie Howe would always say, right, as if everyone you loved is dead. And I think that's sort of like the hardest thing now. It was easier to do when I felt like I had nothing to lose and I felt cut off from everybody I loved. But I'm married now and I have a son, and I think, and to have my beautiful in-laws who are just lovely people, I think has been the hardest hurdle, actually, because I know they're not dead, and I want them to want to read what I write. I want them to approve of it in a way that I didn't care about my own family, and to have to kind of retranslate, like, what does it mean now to write as if everybody I love is dead? Like, what does that look like? I think has been the biggest struggle lately. But so it's slow, but it's starting to come out, and I appreciate that you included me in your folio in Pleiades. So thank you.
Can't wait for to read more work. I can't wait to. I'll be I'll be keeping an eye out.
Thanks. So I think Chris said that he was going to hop in.
Yes.
And there he is.
I apologize. I feel like I don't want to interrupt your conversation. It's been really rich and really powerful. And I feel like if we hadn't set out what we were going to do, I would have just let you guys talking. It's been such a blessing to listen to. But I guess we'll transition now and give you both an opportunity to share a little bit of your work. And then after you're done, I'll hop back in and just a little bit. And we're kind of running over. If you have a couple minutes to do a couple of questions, that would be really wonderful. So you guys okay with that? I don't want to take your time, but okay. All right, so I'll hop off again and you guys can share your work and then I'll hop back in.
I'll just read one poem and then I'll let you take over and read what you will read. And I'll just read the poem that you published in Pleiades. So in case anybody watching doesn't know, EJ Koh curated a folio of Korean American women poets in I think it's the latest issue of Pleiades. And I still haven't received my copy. I might just purchase one because I know that they've been having issues with the mail. Because I'm so curious
for you right away.
No, I'll just purchase one, and it's good to support literary magazines. And so I'll just read the poem that you published there, and it's called Gold. Gold. I've become the kind of creature who, on Sundays, fills 7 small boxes with a bevy of pills to stick it out another week. When will I be fixed enough to hear my kids scream without tearing my father's phantom hands off me? How do demons, decades gone now, still ravage me? Tell me I am not the thing my children will have to survive. Tell me the mob I inherited will not touch my son. Yes, the cavalcade of all that's tried to kill me may forever raid my brain, but know this. In my mother's first language, the word for fracture, for crack, is the same as the word for gold. Every Thursday, for 21 months before my son was born, a doctor trained me to put the gun down and write. I understand. I am one of the lucky ones.
Oh, thank you for reading it. I remember as soon as I read that, I mean, it's kind of like what you were talking about, the emotional labor that you have to go through to uh, write a line as that, and at the end to say that we're one of the lucky ones. I found that so moving. So thank you for reading that and sharing that poem. I'm going to read just one poem too. And it also has my father in it. It's the poem that actually helped me write the first chapter of the memoir. It was helpful because it gave me some sort of skeleton or roadmap to go through what the narrative prose might be for the memoir, but it's going to sound really familiar. It's called Father in His Old Age. There is a Korean belief that you are born the parent of the one you hurt most. Watching my father use chopsticks to split chicken katsu, he confesses that I may be the reincarnation of his own father. We finish our waters in silence and walk home, chatting about who to blame for where we are. He says, the present is the revenge of the past. Revenge goes too far, I argue. And in our unhappiness, we both want to know we cannot pay enough. pain becomes meaning. After this life, I fear I'll never meet him again.
Thank you so much for reading that poem. Because I have it right here. And I revisited your poetry book after reading your memoir, and I actually stopped on that poem thinking that it really resonates. I mean, so much of this book resonates with your memoir as well, but I think especially those first two lines really resonated with your memoir. And it's so, the way that you can distill so much of pain and experience in your poems is just something I really admire. So thank you for reading that.
Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you.
Thank you both for sharing some of your work with us. Yeah, two pieces I'm familiar with as well. So I was reading along with mine. And I actually got a copy of the Pleiades. So the mail does work. It just takes a long time when you order. Your copy will come, Eugenia. Okay, so I just have a couple of questions. I'd love to share with you both, and we'll try to be brief. But I'd love to hear from both of you about, EJ, you write about a little bit in your memoir, but both of your journeys to writing. Like, do you think we can be taught to be poets? You both teach. Can we be taught to be poets, or does writing kind of choose us in terms of, how do you feel about your journeys to coming to poetry? Maybe Eugenia, you could start.
I do think that you can be taught to be a poet. I know some people don't think that, but I was a terrible writer when I first started out. I really think that I was lucky enough to have some good teachers who would say, the feeling is there, but you really need to learn the craft. And here are all the elements of craft that I want you to visit, and all the filters through which you need to look at your poem, and all the tools you need to sculpt it. And I'm grateful people sat with me to give me those tools. And I think if someone is willing to learn those tools, they can be a poet.
That's encouraging. How about you, EJ? Do you agree?
I think so. And to add something small to that is considering what poetry is outside of what we know as poetry. So, for me, I like to climb, and I go on these long walks, and those things have become as big a part of writing my poems as sort of just sitting down and thinking about it. And so I think you're thinking and writing about poetry as you do other things as well. And for me, coming to poetry almost as after trying to become a K-pop star or becoming having a dance crew right in Los Angeles. It it added something to my poetry. It added a, a playfulness with space, with blocking, with choreography, with the interest in buildings and the way things are can add architecture to your poetry. I think there's so many elements that come to it just from a life that's lived. So.
That's helpful and encouraging as well. So a couple of months ago, Eugenia, we don't talk very often, but I do follow your social media pretty religiously. And so I remember you posting that somebody actually used your poem, and they were speaking and they used your poem in I don't know if it was a sermon or somebody was basically quoting a poem that you had written. And I was wondering, for both of you, your work is so personal and so vulnerable. How do you feel about somebody else, using your work, and potentially when we interact with art, we sometimes impose personal meaning onto something that might be very different from what you both intended when you wrote it, because it is so personal. I'm just wondering how you feel about that. Like, do you think there's merit to reading something subjectively, or how important it is for us as readers to understand what you're trying to communicate about your life experiences. I'm just curious what you both think about that.
Well, I'm a firm believer that once the piece that you've written reaches the reader, it no longer belongs to you, it belongs to the reader. And I don't have authority over their experience of that piece. And I want for the reader and the piece to evolve without me. I think that is something that I actually love. And if somebody is able to read into a poem something that I didn't intend, that was meaningful to them, that that some, you know, spirit kind of met them through that and had an interaction that was so separate from me, I welcome that. And I think that's sometimes part of the beauty of something that I love about the work.
Mm, mm.
I agree. I'm just gonna agree with Eugenia on everything. I I think it's actually interesting, and at least in my experience, it's been the other way around. Actually, it's me not knowing what I've done and what has come out, and somebody else being able to identify that and being and having insight. Because I think part of the, with even with the poetry collection, and especially with this memoir, I it's not something I would be able to succinctly describe or even explain and teach someone else how to do, because I was so lost in it. I was so inside the work and the process that I, wanted to create something without knowing that I was creating it. And so when by the time I came out, if anything, I needed help understanding what was done here and what it's doing. And the more I have these conversations and the more I live with the memoir and grow with it, the more those things become apparent to me, and the more I could share it.
Mm, mm.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just one last question, just to be sensitive to your time. I was really moved by this idea of setting the table, and I just thinking about just our current moment. Like, do you have any practical tips for how we could try to set the table in the midst of like where we are and just talking to people that we do disagree with? And how do we, yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any, like, not that there's a recipe book, but are there any practical ways that we could try to incorporate that practice into our life? Because I felt like it was just such a powerful image to paint for, yeah, where we find ourselves. So
Yeah, I love the idea of setting the table. It's such a great way to also try and enter conversation about race, about gender and sex, about um, even about, I don't know, it, it, the more that some subject, question, or idea has gray area, the better it functions with being able to hold things simultaneously. Because you can, I mean, the only thing that matters is you cannot take anything off the table. And what that does is it never takes anything off the table. It makes it so that you're able to speak to somebody and you can't say that what they say isn't true for them, and it's
mm,
something that isn't real. And when you're able to do that, when you're able to acknowledge one another, and when you're able to acknowledge different ideas that may have truths and have reality attached to them, you're better able to make a decision. You're better able to move your heart or move somebody else's heart because you're doing it together also. I mean,
mm,
setting the table is something that's collaborative. It takes so many people, and it takes people who don't fully agree with each other. So it's such a it's wonderful and apply to anything. I mean, even actually asking for a raise, you know, this is what you're not doing. So you can add that to the table, but now you get to add what you want to say to the table, and it makes all those things true. So it's really the opposite of maybe some of what's catching on fire now, which is taking things constantly off the table that other people add. And this is, well, let's just put it all on the table and look at everything together at once, so that we can hold each other, and then as a group, an answer.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. I think that's a great place to end for tonight. And just so thankful for the two of you, for what you do, and for just sharing tonight with us. And yeah, for those of you listening, if you're interested in this kind of dialogue, there is a podcast called Culture Care, and you could probably Google that and hear other conversations like tonight. And just so thankful for all of you who submitted questions and who are watching, and just hope everyone has a great night. And so thanks again, Eugenia and EJ, and just really appreciate you both.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, EJ.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for giving us like almost 10 extra minutes. I know that it felt